but this is, we wrote down these laws of combat. Jocko wrote down these laws of combat specifically because he realized that he saw a SEAL task unit going through training that he was now in charge of, and he saw the SEAL task unit struggling, and they were struggling. They weren't executing the way they should have. They were having a hard time, and they basically failed a training mission and failed it terribly. And he thought, man, these guys are not ready for the difficulties of real world combat operations, just like we just encountered in Ramadi. So what do we need to teach them? And he wrote down those laws of combat: cover, move, simple, prioritize, execute, decentralized command. And he did that because he recognized that they weren't working together as a team. They were not working together as a team to mutually support one another. He had a bunch of individuals or a bunch of different teams within the team that weren't supporting each other, going in different directions. So they had to cover and move for each other. Simple. No one really understood what the mission was and what role they should play in the mission. They put out a very complex mission, so people didn't understand what they needed to do, and they couldn't execute. So they needed to simplify things, and then prioritize and execute. They were taking on too many tasks at the same time. They had 25 different things that they were trying to handle. And of course, when you try to take on 25 different tasks at the same time, what happens? You're going to fail at all of them. So any team has to figure out what the highest priority is, focus the resources toward accomplishing that highest priority task, and then move on to the next task. So they needed to prioritize and execute and communicate that priority to the rest of the team so that everybody can focus their efforts on the highest priority task. And then finally, decentralized command. I mean, we saw this team that was sitting around just waiting to be told what to do, waiting for the big boss man to make a decision. And the senior person in charge of the task unit commander was tied up, got sucked into the details of a particular problem, wasn't making the decisions. And so no one made the decision. So they all just sat there and waited, and they took more casualties, and they had all kinds of problems. And the problems just compounded into a disaster situation. So that's where Jocko came up with those 4 laws of combat. And the first time that he came and briefed the training course that I was running. So when we got back from Ramadi, I'd just been a platoon commander, in these violent, combat operations where I learned some really tough lessons. And I taught the next generation of SEAL for 2 years. I went through every single SEAL officer that graduated from our training pipeline. I taught through this class. I taught a 5-week class where I gave them, I gave them everything I wish someone had taught me before I went into some difficult operations. And so that was kind of a hard thing to, to think about when we were, when I had to prioritize and what I was going to actually teach to the team. So when the first thing I wanted to do was bring Jocko in to talk about what the lessons that we learned. And when I did that, Jocko laid out these 4 laws of combat. I think before he actually taught the class, he came in and showed me what he'd written down. And so we went through each of them: cover, move, simple, prioritize, and execute, decentralized command. And I'd never actually used those terms in this kind of these four laws and thought about them as laws of combat. And that's what we're doing. But as he went through each of those things, I'm like, absolutely, man, we had to cover, move. Absolutely. We got to keep things simple. Absolutely. We got to prioritize and execute. Absolutely. We got to use decentralized command. We got to have leaders step up at every level and lead. And so most of you are familiar with these laws of combat. We've talked about them on this training. But I wanted to go into how extreme ownership plays into each of these things, because we hear it all the time where we're talking to a team, we're talking to a fire department or a police department or an agency where they're telling us, hey, we don't have cover move, or we don't have good relationships with, another department force we have to work with, or this other agency that we have to work alongside, or, our dispatchers understand what the guys in the field actually need, or, our senior leadership, doesn't get what we're actually dealing with out here. Or the senior leadership says my frontline troops don't understand how what they do can impact our entire team in a strategic negative way. So we get all that kind of breakdown, on the cover move front. And the reality is, there's a lot of finger pointing that happens. It's not our fault. It's the other department's fault, or it's the leadership's fault, or it's the guys in the field's fault, or it's dispatch's fault, or it's administrative support's fault, or it's supply's fault for not giving us what we needed, or it's this federal agency that we have to work with, or the local the local agency we work with that doesn't help us, or the fire department versus police departments, et cetera. All these different friction points that come into play. And everybody is looking at everybody else instead of themselves. And you got to look at yourself. Extreme ownership is not about anybody else. It's about you. So if you don't take ownership of a problem, what happens to that problem? The problem doesn't get solved. It damn sure doesn't get solved, and it usually actually gets worse. So if you're waiting for that other person that you don't have a good relationship with, that you don't think is supporting you the way that you need the support, then you need to stop casting blame, stop making excuses, stop pointing the finger at them, and actually look at yourself and say, okay, what can I do to go build a better relationship with my chain of command, with my, with my head shed, with the frontline guys in the field, with this other department that I depend on, with this other agency that we actually work alongside. Those problems are not going to get solved if you don't actually take that for action. And understanding that, really the essence of Cover Move is it's not about anybody else. It's about you. It's all about you. And I'm sorry, it's not about you. It's about the mission. And so extreme ownership is not about anybody else. Extreme ownership is about you. But when you're talking about Cover Move, it's about the mission. And so it's not about you, it's about the mission. And so when you're working with other departments, when you're working with your team, you want the entire team to be successful. You want everybody to be successful. So if you take extreme ownership, you look internally at yourself and focus on yourself. When you're thinking about Cover Move, you're thinking about everybody else and how you can help the team. I'm not seeking credit. I'm not thinking about, it's all about me. It's my shift versus this other shift here. I'm actually going to do the best I can to give this other shift the best turnover I can to set them up for success so that we can all be successful. That's the essence of Cover Move. And so you're only going to do that when you apply extreme ownership to yourself about what you can do to build better relationships, to communicate more effectively, and actually get those problems solved. It's the same thing with simple, right? The second law of combat. It is so easy for people to say, well, I don't really understand what's going on here. Somebody needs to come and communicate it to me. This is what we say all the time, or, my team doesn't get it. I told them what we needed, or I asked for support from that other department, or I gave this other shift a turnover and they didn't do it, or they didn't listen, or, they didn't, obviously they didn't take the information on board, or they just blew it off. And it's really easy to point fingers and cast blame and make excuses to put all the blame on them. And again, just like we cover Move, you're not going to get that problem solved if you're not actually taking ownership. You have to take ownership. So what does that look like? The test for whether or not you communicated things in a simple, clear, concise manner, the test for whether or not you have effectively kept things simple is that they get it. And whether you're talking about communicating up the chain of command to your boss, your boss's boss, to dispatch, to another department you support, to the guys in the field, to another unit you got to work alongside to actually support you. And that's that. You actually, if they're not doing what you need them to do, don't get frustrated with them. Don't get angry with them. The first thing you need to do is look at yourself and think, okay, have I communicated things in a manner that was simple, clear, concise, that they understand? And rather than wait for someone to come explain things to you, if you don't understand what you're trying to do or why you're trying to do it, then you got to have the courage to actually ask questions and say, okay, hold on a second. Can I better understand what we're trying to do here, so that I understand my role and I can go out there and execute? And we use that read back tool, in the military, and it's something that you all should be familiar with and use as well. If you're putting out information to people, the best thing you can do is ask them for a read back. And it's not a test for them, whether or not they were listening. It's a test for whether or not you communicated things in a manner that was simple, clear, concise. So I can say, hey, Jeff, do you understand? I don't actually say, Jeff, do you understand? Because if I say that, what is he going to say? He's going to say, he's going to say yes. That's what you're going to get. But if I actually say, Jeff, can you talk me back through this particular aspect of the plan? So to use a combat mission, maybe I would use our escape and evasion plan. Hey, Jeff, explain to me, if you're out there on the battlefield on your own, how are you going to signal? Where are you going to expect to rendezvous with friendly forces? What units are you going to link up with? What radio nets are you going to be monitoring? And then I know that he understands it. And if he doesn't, then I'm not going to flame spray him, to use our Navy term, to yell and scream at people. I'm going to actually realize that the problem is not Jeff's fault. The problem is my fault. I need to better explain this. And so if Jeff doesn't understand it, there's probably a lot of people on the team that don't understand it too. So again, this is the power of extreme ownership. You can understand these laws of combat, understand that, hey, we need to keep things simple, but it's something very different to realize that instead of getting frustrated with other people, you need to actually raise your hand, ask questions. You need to use a read back to make sure that your team understands it. You need to follow up with people to say, okay, we talked about this in the meeting yesterday of all, we talked about 50 different things. These are the most important takeaways that I took from that. Just want to make sure we're all on the same page. You can use that readback tool in email format to follow up an in-person meeting or phone call or a video teleconference that you had as well. So if you don't take action to solve those problems, nobody else is going to do it. And again, extreme ownership is not about anybody else. It's about you. So you've got to make sure that everything is communicated in a manner that's simple, clear, concise. Ask those questions, take ownership of problems, be proactive to make sure that your people understand what's going on. Use that readback tool. Third law of combat, prioritize and execute. I get this all the time where people are saying, hey, the things are always changing, priorities are always changing, it's the flavor of the week. How do I deal with this? And the reality is I don't know any place, any industry or business we work with, the battlefield certainly is this way. Things are always changing all the time. So you've got to be flexible. You've got to keep an open mind to things. But you also have to take a step back and figure out what the priorities are. And if you've got 12 or 15 things that are getting pushed down, and you're saying all of these things need to get done right now, well, how are you going to take on those things? If you ask up the chain to say, hey, I need some help prioritizing, and you're told they're all important, which is a pretty common thing that we see among leaders and something I've dealt with as well in my time in the military, then you have to actually take a step back, detach, and prioritize yourself so that you can execute on the highest priority task. That's what you have to do. If I try to take on 12 or 15 things at the same time, I'm going to fail at all of them. So I've got to constantly, what we teach is relax, look around, make a call. And I have to be able to do that myself. If most of the time the priorities become pretty clear when the moment that you detach, the moment that you pull yourself back from the details is the moment that you can actually see, oh, okay, obviously in the strategic view of things, this seems to be the highest priority. And then look, if you're still unclear, then you can take that and communicate up the chain after you've prioritized a list to ask for some clarification and say, hey, I just want to double check this to make sure these priorities align with what your leadership's priorities are. And usually you're going to get an answer about, oh, well, yeah, that looks great. Go do it. Or, hey, you know what? I think actually priority number 3 should be priority number 1. Great. Then you get the information that you need. Oftentimes, when priorities shift, the information does not get communicated to everybody else. So that's something you got to do as a leader, is to make sure you are proactively pushing those priorities down all the time. I still have to learn this, even though I teach this stuff. And I was just talking to my team, we're talking about some marketing things and what our priority should be. And in my mind, those priorities are absolutely clear. It should be absolutely clear what the priorities are. Guess what? It's not clear to my team. It's not clear to my team because when they're looking at it, they've got 25 different things they're trying to cover down on. There's not enough time or not enough resources to do all these things. And they're not sure what the priorities are. So the common trap for leaders here is that it's easy for us to follow it. And the priorities should be obvious to everybody. They are never obvious to the team that's out there on the front lines. It's focused on the mission. You've got to make sure those priorities are clear all the time. You got to constantly assess and make sure that those priorities are clear so that everybody can align behind the highest priority task. And again, if you don't do this stuff, who's going to do it? Who's going to do it? Nobody's going to do it. You got to do it. If you're going to sit there and just wait for someone to sit down and give you a brief on what the priorities are, they're not going to do that. You have to go ask. You have to go get some clarification. And by the way, if you're not getting clarification on what the priorities are, then look at yourself about how you're asking that question. Maybe your tone and inflection is insinuating that you know better or that you disagree, or you don't like the direction that you're being told to go or what the leadership thinks the priority tasks are. So look at yourself, ask those earnest questions, as Jocko says, right? An earnest question is okay, I'm actually seeking an answer here. I'm not just being condescending or thinking, what are we doing that for? Why is that the priority? That doesn't make any sense to me. Because when you attack someone like that, that attacks egos. Someone else's ego is going to flare. You're not going to get the information you need. You're going to create a frictional relationship. And so you're not going to be able to get those priorities or have them explained to you. And again, don't point fingers at others. Look at yourself first. Take ownership of getting the task prioritized, of seeking what the priority should be, of getting aligned on those strategic priorities so that you can communicate that to your team, yourself, and all those around you as well. And then finally, decentralized command. Decentralized command. This is kind of we talk about this as being kind of the most important laws of combat, and obviously how you get to decentralized command is through the other laws of combat: cover, move, simple, prioritize, and execute. If all those things are working well on your team and you're implementing them, then you can have a culture of decentralized command where everyone leads, everybody steps up, everybody makes decisions, everybody can actually solve problems and maneuver the team in the direction they need to go in order to be successful and win. Now, this doesn't mean you get to do whatever you want to do, right? It means that you have to understand the commander's intent, as we call it in the military, and a term probably a lot of you use in your world as well. Commander's intent just simply means purpose, goal, end state. What is the purpose? What is the goal? What's the end state that we're trying to achieve? And then, of course, I've got to understand the parameters within which I can make decisions, outside of which I can't make decisions. I've got to be absolutely crystal clear about those things so that I can execute with confidence. And this is usually where we see the breakdown in decentralized command. I get leaders who think, well, you're saying, I need to let my team step up and lead, but I don't trust my team. I don't trust my team to be able to make those decisions. And so if you don't trust your team to make those decisions, then obviously you can't execute with decentralized command. So how is that going to work? Well, you got to train your team. They're not just magically gonna know what to do. Be very clear about what the purpose, goal, end state is and what those parameters are within which they can make decisions, outside of which they can't make decisions. So you have to put in a training program, a regular training program. That can be an informal training program where you're bringing leaders together, you're presenting a case study, you're doing some role play scenarios, you're asking them for some inputs on how they would make particular decisions so that they could kind of step into a role above their pay grade and think about what those strategic priorities are going to be. Those are those are things you should be doing all the time, and that will give you the confidence in your team and give them the confidence to be able to step up and make those decisions so they can better understand it. This also goes up the chain of command as well. And we hear this all the time from leaders, and particularly in the first responder world, where my battalion chief's not giving me he doesn't trust me, or, my boss or the police chief or the city council is actually, looking over our shoulders. They don't trust us. And there's any level of chain of command, it's really easy to fall in that trap. And you probably heard me say, I was the chief haterade drinker in Tasking a Bruiser, where, not only our commanding officer, who was 30 miles away from us, didn't understand what was going on down here on the front lines. And then my commanding officer's boss, the Green Beret colonel in charge of all special operations units in Iraq at the time, so my boss's boss, he doesn't understand what's going on here. His JAG officer, his lawyers ask us all kinds of questions and scrutinizing what we're doing. And the reality is, what you're doing is pointing fingers and casting blame and saying, everything I'm doing is awesome. They're all screwed up above me in the chain of command. And this is a common trap that leaders are falling into. That is the opposite of extreme ownership. It's the opposite of extreme ownership. I'm putting all the blame on my chain of command and saying it's all their fault. Look, it is not on your chain of command. It is not their obligation to give you trust and allow you to go execute. It is your obligation to earn that trust from them. And that's the power of extreme ownership. That is humbling. That is not what we want to hear. That is not what we want to hear. No one wants to hear that. And yet it's the reality. If I actually take ownership, let's say even at Echelon front, and use this scenario, or we can use this scenario on the battlefield, as Jocko is my task unit commander. If Jocko doesn't trust me to make some decisions on the battlefield, and he's looking over my shoulder, and he's got some real questions about how I'm making the decisions or why I'm making a certain decision, that's not Jocko's fault. It's my fault for not earning that trust from him, not pushing more information up the chain, not keeping him informed, not understanding what his commander's intent is and getting aligned behind those goals. And the more that I do that, the more leadership capital that I'm building with Jocko, my boss, so that I can actually go out and execute with decentralized command. This is the key to getting the boss off your back. And as soon as I realized, the reason we were getting some questions and scrutiny from that JAG at CJSOT of AP headquarters, which was the Green Beret colonel in charge of 200 special operations unit in Iraq, was because I wasn't pushing the information up the chain of command. He was, they had questions and scrutiny about how we were implementing the rules of engagement or why we were doing certain things, and they were reading my reports. I wrote those reports. So if they still had questions after reading my reports, it was because I wasn't communicating up the chain. I wasn't pushing the information up the chain. I didn't understand what they actually needed from me. And so communicating it in a way that someone who was back at headquarters, far from the battlefield, could understand. And so once I did that, and I saw things from their perspective, the questions and scrutiny, I mean, just dropped off massively. And it didn't go to zero, but it certainly it went away in a huge way. It dropped from a ton and constant and frequent to almost none, almost never. So that's what you got to do, is take ownership of leading up the chain of command, of pushing information up the chain of command, of getting aligned with your chain of command, of building relationships up the chain of command, and earning trust that way. And it's the same thing down the chain too. If you don't trust your team to actually step up and lead, you got to train them, you got to mentor them, you got to empower them, and you got to spend the time with them so that they can actually step up and lead. And the best units out there are actually letting their team lead, because they know that once something bad happens, they're probably not going to be able to be on scene there to make decisions for their people. So they've got to train their people. They got to spend time with their people so that they can actually make decisions and make things happen to get problems solved in real time. So this is just a look at how extreme ownership plays into each of these 4 laws of combat. And I know most of you are intimately familiar with those laws of combat. And these are powerful tools that every team has to use to be successful. But those things are not just going to magically get implemented. You are going to have to take extreme ownership to implement these laws of combat. And if you're waiting for somebody else out there to, this other department needs to come to me and build a better relationship with me, it's not going to happen. If you're waiting for somebody else to sit down and explain things to you, it's not going to happen. Or your team to come to you to ask questions. Well, they know I have an open door policy. Why are they coming to ask me questions? Well, guess what? People are scared to come to ask the boss questions. So you got to get out of your office and go ask them questions and make sure they understand and ask for that readback. That's what you're going to have to do. Prioritize and execute. No matter how much you think that the priorities should be clear, they are never clear to those folks out in the front lines that are involved in the day-to-day challenges of their tasks and their job. So you're going to have to get out and make sure they understand those priorities. And as those priorities shift, communicate them and ask for clarity up the chain of command as well. And it's the same thing for decentralized command. To empower yourself to step up and lead, to empower your team to step up and lead, you have got to take ownership to build that trust that's required to make sure that everybody is clear about commander's intent and parameters where they can make decisions, outside of which they can't make decisions. And if you take ownership of those issues, you are going to be able to implement the laws of combat to effectively lead your team to victory.